On today's World Insight, tensions in cross-strait relations. What are the red lines over Taiwan? What's the status quo, and what gets in the way of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait? And a seasoned American diplomat who's now a Yale law lecturer with an insider view on the significance of the first Xi-Biden virtual meeting. Up close with former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Susan Thornton.
That meeting and communicating between U.S. and Chinese leaders is part of the normal, routine business of international relations.
Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. The program is coming to you live. I'm Tian Wei. Tuesday's virtual meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden sent a clear message where both sides stand on a series of concerns, particularly on the hot-button issues over Taiwan. President Xi Jinping from China warned Taiwan independence, quote-unquote, moves are extremely dangerous. Well, Mr. Biden reiterated U.S. support for the One China policy. Differences did surface on how to maintain the cross-strait status quo and ways to bring peace and stability. On Thursday, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said the U.S. should adhere to the One China principle and the 3 joint communiques, the very political foundation of China-U.S. relations.
世界上只有一个中国，台湾是中国的一部分。
President Xi Jinping said clearly in the meeting that the One China principle and the 3 China-U.S. joint communiques are the political foundation of China-U.S. relations. We are sincere when we say we are striving for peaceful reunification. That said, should the Taiwan separatist forces provoke us or cross the red line, we will be compelled to take resolute measures. President Biden had also reaffirmed that the U.S. stands by the One China policy and does not support the Taiwan separatists.
On the hot-button issue of Taiwan, we turn to our panelists. In Philadelphia, Nathan Mahboubi from the Center of Study of Contemporary China with the University of Pennsylvania. In Beijing, Da Wei, professor and senior fellow of the Center for International Strategy and Security with Tsinghua University. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to see both of you again. Long time no see. We were all talking about that, isn't it, before this interview? But let me start by asking a direct question. How much danger is there with the latest moves and the rhetorics? Mr. Mahboubi.
Well, thank you for having me back on. It's nice to talk to you again. I think the first thing I just want to say is that by all accounts, this meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi on Monday was very productive. There's a lot of very encouraging news that is coming out from that meeting. Of course, we're talking about the most difficult issue of Taiwan today, but I do want to underscore that the larger environment has really had a shift in tone over the course of the past week or two, including with the joint statement on climate at the COP26 meeting. In terms of Taiwan, I think it's very clear that this is a difficult issue between the 2 countries right now. I think part of the goal of the meeting was to establish some guardrails so that the differences of opinion over Taiwan don't spill out and derail other aspects of the relationship. And I'm sure we're going to get into the details of the 2 sides' different positions over the course of this conversation. But I did want to at least start off by acknowledging that this was a very productive meeting on Monday, and it has a lot of positive signals for the environment generally, even though this Taiwan issue is very difficult.
Okay, Professor Da.
Yes, I agree with Nathan that, of course, Taiwan issue is the most important, most sensitive, and most dangerous points in the bilateral relations, particularly before the summit. We heard all those kind of rhetoric exchanges across China and the United States and across the strait. And we noticed the news about the military maneuver, this kind of thing. So many people are discussing, are we heading for a war or military conflict? So, but in this summit, I think, or the virtual meeting, I think the two leaders, I think they stressed the importance of the stability of the Taiwan Strait.
Okay.
So I hope, yeah, I believe that from this point, I believe that in the short run, the temperature could be cooled down a little bit over the Taiwan Strait.
Right.
I cross my fingers.
Well, that's a very interesting way that you put it, cross the fingers, because we really don't know. Because right after the virtual summit between the two presidents, the U.S. president, in answering questions from the press, have been talking about some of the other issues that might be taken as stepping back from what he has committed at the virtual meeting. And the media, of course, played up that with the stories that they want to make. So, Mr. Mabumi, how much do you think is the danger of playing with rhetorics and playing with the different so-called rhetorical strategic ambiguity? What would that mean for the predictable future of the issue of Taiwan, which the both presidents were trying to commit to?
So my perspective on this starts from understanding that both presidents have domestic audiences that they're speaking to at the same time that they're speaking to each other. In that virtual meeting that they had, most of that was not public to us. Most of that was behind closed doors over their Zoom connection. And my sense is that that is the most important discussion. Less important are things that they might be saying outside of the discussion, which may be in many ways tailored for other audiences. Definitely, the two sides have different views on this, but the sense that I have from the virtual meeting is that they were able to establish that status quo that has served the relationship so well over this issue of Taiwan for so many years is still supported by both sides.
As you may know, after not long after
rhetoric
that,
will sure.
As you may know, not long after that, there's also interviews with other leaders in the Asia-Pacific region. Singapore, of course, has been a long-time observer of the situation between China and the United States. Prime Minister talking about maybe not immediate crisis. However, he is still worried and concerned about the, playing out of the original planned framework. So I think there is right there quite some concern about the flip-flop of rhetorics over there. Mr. Babubi.
So I don't know about flip-flop. I think one thing that I keep thinking to myself, there's this very famous Chinese Chengyu, the same bed, different dreams. That has been the framework for the two sides on the Taiwan issue for a very long time. The language of one China policy, but then the two sides have their own additional elements to it. But the status quo has been basically understanding that the same bed part encompasses enough that the different dreams are not as significant. Those different dreams are going to be expressed on both sides, and we're not going to be able to stop that. But as long as people can stay in the same framework of the same bed, essentially, and not spilling out into more aggressive conflict, then I think that's the best we can hope for on this issue.
Professor Da, one China policy, that's the U.S. term. One China principle, that's the China term. And China-U.S., according to China's side, working on the issue, agree on the issue of Taiwan with the one China principle and also the 3 joint communique. While the U.S. is listing out 3 documents which the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson described, not necessarily all of them are credible. Let me just put it that way. Professor Da, how do you see rhetorics? How do you see real understanding of bottom lines?
I think the two sides actually believe, understand, knows the other side's bottom line, I guess. The problem is, as you pointed out, China have the one China principle, while the US have its own one China policy, and that's different. And in both concepts, there are different elements, a lot of different elements in, for example, in the US for one China policy. So when the president meet with Chinese leader, he may stress some elements of the one China policy, while when he faces the domestic audience, he stress other parts, other elements of the one China policy. So I think this is because of the, as Nathan pointed out, different audience, domestic political consideration. Mm-hmm. But I think the bottom line need to be very clear for China. The status of Taiwan cannot be changed. Taiwan is part of China, and for the U.S., I think. At least now, I think U.S. hope that China, or the two sides of Cross-Strait, can resolve their differences with the peaceful means.
Professor Da, I want to go back in history a little bit, because we could only understand what is now and what is the future by understand better about the history. Back in the Bush Junior administration, there was a time when the independent forces in Taiwan, according to the Chinese central government, has been playing with fire. However, at the end of the day, the U.S. President George W. Bush did put it very clearly about where U.S. stand. And since then, various administrations have been stand by that principle until the end of the Trump administration, which has been destroying many principles between China and the United States and the United States and the rest of the world. So how do you see, the shall I say, worrisome legacy, quote unquote, I should say, of the Trump administration and the responsibilities of the current administration in the U.S. about this issue and beyond?
I think, as you said, I think Trump administration have hollowed up the one China policy a lot. The framework, the concept is still there, but the content has been hollowed up. So this is the problem of the Trump administration. And this administration, the Biden administration, has not changed that tendency. Actually, I think it continues some of the actions of the Trump administration. So this is a little bit disappointed for Chinese, I think. I think this is the duty of this administration to reverse that direction, I guess.
UPenn, the University of Pennsylvania, Mr. Mahboubi, is well known, particularly your center for researching on the latest policy toward China. What is your understanding, with our very limited time left, about what this administration right now in the U.S. is working on in terms of China and using Taiwan as further leverage against China?
I don't know that the administration is trying to use Taiwan as leverage against China. I do agree that obviously the issue of Taiwan has become much more fraught in recent years, and I would argue that it's not just because of actions by the Trump administration, but also actions by China. I think both sides have brought us to this point, and it will be incumbent on both sides to pull back. In pulling back, because of those domestic audiences, some of the pullback may not be very visible at first. It may not be something that they issue press releases about. But I think in terms of actions over the course of the next period, probably we will see some pullback on both sides. But then the rest of the relationship, I think there are lots of issues in play right now, including trade, including potential cooperation on climate, including this very encouraging dialogue on nuclear
non-proliferation. Every part of that will be further explored by our future discussions. But on that, you said there might be steps taken by the U.S. side to walk back. What exactly are you referring to? 20 seconds, if you can, sir.
I think the two sides. So on the Chinese side, it would be less of these airplane incursions into Taiwan defense space. And on the U.S. side could be, instead of sending carriers through every month, maybe every other month.
Interesting.
Little things like that are just indicating that.
Okay. Less 10 seconds also, Mr. Da, also your final response. We wrap it up.
Yeah, I think as Nathan said, I think the U.S. side need to reduce its those kind of rhetoric and sending senators to the U.S. to Taiwan with airplane. This kind of action, I think it's harmful for the stability.
All right, I'd love to have this conversation continued. Our time is limited, but so far, thank you so much for both of you joining us. I'm sure this topic will be further discussed in the future. We would love to invite you back again. Nathan Mabubi, Wei. Really appreciate, gentlemen. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, a seasoned American diplomat who's now a Yale law lecturer with an insider view on the significance of the first Xi-Biden virtual meeting. I'll get you up close with the former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Susan Thornton. This is one of my quite a number of interviews with her. This is the latest, of course. Welcome back. This is World Insight. The program is coming to you live. I'm Tian Wei. Uncertainties have challenged bilateral relations between the world's two largest economies, China and the United States. After the first virtual meeting between Chinese and American top leaders, there is hope for a stop to the downward spiral and a possible turning point. Although the talk was a good start, how much diplomatic work lies ahead? What more can be done with pragmatic cooperation despite competition? On that, I talked to Susan Thornton again, a senior fellow at the Pao-Tsai China Center for Yale Law School, who was the former acting U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Let's listen in. And I'm very glad and honored to be joined on this discussion on China-U.S. relations by Susan Thornton, senior fellow at the Pao-Tsai China Center of Yale Law School, former acting assistant secretary of U.S. State Department for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Susan, such a pleasure to see you once again.
Thanks for having me, Tian Wei.
Now, Susan, your takeaway from the first virtual meeting.
Well, I was really pleased, Tian Wei, to see the two leaders being able to meet. Even though it was virtual, it was still, very much a warm meeting. It was a long meeting. There were more lengthy discussions, a lot of preparation. Both sides are paying a lot more attention to maybe the publics at home as opposed to sort of getting into the meat and substance of the diplomacy. Feels to me like there's a lot of public posturing going on in the relationship over the last actually several years, not just in the most recent 10 months under the Biden administration. And I think the meeting was important for trying to start to get away from speaking to each other in the sort of public space and actually do some real diplomacy where you can have a private conversation with another leader, try to talk about concrete things and get things done. And for me, it sort of reestablishes that meeting and communicating between U.S. and Chinese leaders is part of the normal, routine business of international relations. It makes it regular and routine, and I think that's good. We need to get these communication channels reestablished.
In the readouts by both sides, there seems to be not an intention to persuade the other side about exactly what is the nature of this relationship. Earlier, we know there were enormous debates in both sides about this. How do you see this phenomenon?
I think it's probably on purpose that each side is trying to avoid labeling. I know the U.S. side had talked a lot about that earlier on in the beginning of the Biden administration, that they didn't think it was necessary to have a label or a frame for the relationship. They just wanted to try to make sure that we were preparing for this stiff competition and that we would solve problems as they came up. And I think, that was not a very compelling response for the Chinese side, who's now trying to sort of come up with their own way of talking about it that's not competition, obviously.
How to make sure the bureaucracies on both sides will establish relevant communications with one another on some of the points made clear agreed by both leaders is an important thing. Now, Susan, you served in the State Department. You also participated in enormous amount of bilateral meetings between China and the United States, sometimes on very crucial and fundamental issues. How do you see the procedure of doing that?
Well, it's very important that the two leaders actually had this meeting so that they can task their officials to go ahead and set up these communication channels, first of all. So they're vested with the authority of the top leadership and their vision for what should be going on. But I think second, there tends to be a bit of a mismatch between the US and China on the degree to which China values the kind of ceremony, the protocol of a major meeting, and the US wants to get right down to solving the problem and talking about specifics. And I think you do see that kind of mismatch happening over and over and over again in the China-US relationship. But, without getting these kinds of conversations started, we can't start to solve these problems. And so I hope they'll be able to set them up at in a fairly low profile way, but sooner, I think, is better.
How resilient do you think the result of and takeaway of this virtual meeting will be in enduring some of the ups and downs and challenges of this relationship, which has been there for quite some time?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the two leaders, they know each other from previous encounters, of course, going back decades. They do have a more familiarity with one another than other leaders have had. But it's still hard in the US-China relationship to keep any momentum going for very long, especially if something knocks us off course. And there's always things to knock us off course. The most recent big thing to knock us off course, and it's relevant here, is the COVID-19 pandemic, because it is contributing to this problem of lack of communication between the two sides. I imagine that the Biden administration without COVID might have come in and started some communications a little bit earlier, but was unable to do that, of course. And so it's still a factor going forward to see how often we're going to be able to meet in person coming through this winter. And I think, that's really important. Those personal communications, visits, face-to-face meetings are very important.
China has been having some challenges in understanding the sincerity coming from this administration about the China-US relations. How should we judge the sincerities from both sides in terms of delivering the results of the meeting?
Well, this is where I think you have to look at the things that were said in the meeting. And I think Joe Biden did make a number of statements in the meeting that were meant to be reassuring to China on many of these fronts. But you also have to look at the actions that are going to follow the meeting and see how the things that were said are going to be actually put into practice following up on the meeting. And I think that's really where the kind of mistrust or suspicion is going to be ameliorated, in seeing whether this meeting can actually lead to a tamping down of some of the very public recriminations that we've seen on a lot of these issues, and also a kind of a toning down of some of the language in public that has been, I think, difficult for both sides to handle given the domestic politics around the relationship. So, we'll see if, this is why I think the meeting was good, but it's still a test, and we need to keep testing as we're going forward. We're not, as one of my Chinese colleagues said the other day, there's no silver bullet for US-China relations.
Both sides, after decades of having very close interaction and grow together, both have tools to damage this relationship directly, fast. We've seen that being demonstrated over the past few years. Now, how much do you think both sides now understand that there are tools that they can use for negotiations and for things to happen to a better place as they plan? But there are tools that they really cannot pick up because that's going to really hurt the fundamentals of this relationship. Do you think both sides understand that now?
I think there are some people on both sides that do understand that. I'm not sure everyone understands that. And I do worry about this because we tend to have gotten pretty impatient about our diplomacy, about our negotiations. You know, these things take a long time to come to fruition. And it feels to me like we've become, you know, a bit disillusioned or disenchanted with the kind of hard work that goes into reaching an agreement through, you know, just diplomatic work, diplomatic efforts. And sometimes people want to reach for a big stick as a tool that they think that can sort of stir things up and get a solution. And that doesn't tend to bring a lot of progress in my experience.
Then before we go, last question and quick answer, hopefully, that, you know, we have this virtual meeting after more than a year, after 10 months since the Biden came into the office. What's next to you? If you were in the State Department, if you were still serving this administration, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think that they will try to set up a number of these communication channels. We need to get a security dialogue going. I hope it will be consisting of military and diplomatic officials. I think the trade discussion should continue. We need a conversation about managing the pandemic economic recovery, and also more on transnational issues like climate change and global health. If we can get all of those strands of communication going, I'm pretty sure we will be able to come up with some concrete outcomes that can put some actions onto the words from the meeting. And that's the direction that I hope we would be going in.
Susan Thornton, as always, thank you so much, ma'am, for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. Actions need to follow words. That's what's said in that interview. World Insight is dedicated to bring you more discussions about those actions and how those actions are being taken in our future programs. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.